The American Yawp, Chapter 6, The American Revolution. Section 1, Introduction. In the 1760s, Benjamin Rush, a native of Philadelphia, recounted a visit to Parliament. Upon seeing the king's throne in the House of Lords, Rush said he felt as if he walked on sacred ground, with emotions that I cannot describe. Throughout the 18th century, colonists had developed significant emotional ties with both the British monarchy and the British Constitution. The British North American colonists had just helped to win a world war, and most, like Rush, had never been more proud to be British. And yet, in a little over a decade, those same colonists would declare their independence and break away from the British Empire. Seen from 1763, nothing would have seemed as improbable as the American Revolution. The Revolution built institutions and codified the language and ideas that still define Americans' image of themselves to this day. Moreover, revolutionaries justified their new nation with radical new ideals that changed the course of history and sparked a global age of revolution. But the revolution was as paradoxical as it was unpredictable. A revolution fought in the name of liberty allowed slavery to persist. Resistance to centralized authority tied disparate colonies ever closer together under new governments. The revolution created politicians eager to foster Republican selflessness and protect the public good, but also encouraged individual self-interest and personal gain. The Founding Fathers instigated and fought a revolution to secure independence from Britain, but they did not fight that revolution to create a, quote, democracy. To successfully rebel against Britain, however, required more than a few dozen Founding Fathers. Common colonists joined the fight, unleashing popular forces that shaped the revolution itself, often in ways not welcomed by elite leaders. But once unleashed, these popular forces continued to shape the new nation, and indeed the rest of American history. Section 2, The Origins of the American Revolution. The American Revolution had both long-term origins and short-term causes. The long-term origins included political, intellectual, cultural, and economic developments in the 18th century that set the context for the crisis of the 1760s and 1770s. Between the Glorious Revolution of 1688 and the middle of the 18th century, Britain had largely failed to define the colony's relationship to the empire and institute a coherent program of imperial reform. Two factors contributed to these failures. First, Britain was at war from the War of the Spanish Succession at the start of the century through the 7 Years' War in 1763. Constant war was politically consuming and economically expensive. Second, competing visions of empire divided British officials. Establishment Whigs and their Tory supporters envisioned an authoritarian empire based on conquering territory and extracting resources. They wanted to eliminate Britain's growing national debt by raising taxes and cutting spending on the colonies. The radical, or patriot, Whigs based their imperial vision on trade and manufacturing instead of land and resources. They argued that economic growth, not raising taxes, would solve the national debt. Instead of an authoritarian empire, patriot Whigs supported a laissez-faire, hands-off approach to empire that would prioritize fostering trade between the colonies and the mother country. There were occasional attempts to reform the administration of the colonies, but debate between the two sides prevented coherent reform. Colonists, however, developed their own understanding of how they fit into the empire. They saw themselves as British subjects entitled to all the natural, essential, inherent, and inseparable rights of our fellow subjects in Great Britain. The 18th century brought significant economic and demographic growth to the colonies. This success, they believed, resulted partly from Britain's hands-off approach to the colonies. With their growing economic importance, colonists believed that they held a special place in the empire. In 1764, James Otis Jr. wrote, "The colonists are entitled to as ample rights, liberties, and privileges as the subjects of the mother country are, and in some respects to more." In this same period, the colonies developed their own local political institutions. Samuel Adams, in the Boston Gazette, described the colonies as each being a, quote, separate body politic from Britain. Almost immediately upon each colony's settlement, they created a colonial assembly. These assemblies assumed many of the same duties as the commons exercised in Britain, including taxing residents, managing the spending of the colonial government's revenue, and granting salaries to royal officials. In the early 1700s, colonial leaders lobbied the British government to define their assembly's legal prerogatives, but Britain was too occupied with European wars. Royal governors tasked by the Board of Trade attempted to limit the power of the assemblies, but the assemblies' power only grew throughout the 18th century. Many colonists came to see their assemblies as having the same jurisdiction over them that Parliament exercised over those in England. They interpreted British inaction as justifying their tradition of local governance. The Crown and Parliament, however, disagreed. Political culture in the colonies also developed differently than that of the mother country. In both Britain and the colonies, land ownership was the key to political participation, but because land was more easily obtained in the colonies, a higher proportion of male colonists participated in politics. Colonial political culture drew inspiration from the country party in Britain. These ideas, generally referred to as the ideology of republicanism, stressed the corrupting nature of power and the importance of virtue, i.e., putting the public good over their own self-interest. Patriots would need to be ever vigilant against the rise of conspiracies, centralized control, and tyranny. Though only a small fringe in Britain held these ideas, in the colonies they were widely accepted. In the 1740s, two seemingly conflicting bodies of thought, the Enlightenment and the Great Awakening, began to combine in the colonies. Both of these movements would challenge older ideas about authority in ways that would help shape the Revolution. Perhaps no single philosopher had a greater impact on colonial thinking than John Locke. In his essay concerning human understanding, Locke argued that the mind was originally a tabula rasa, blank slate, and that individuals were formed primarily by their environment. The aristocracy, then, were wealthy or successful because they had greater access to wealth, education, and patronage, and not because they were innately superior. Locke followed this essay with some thoughts concerning education, which introduced radical new ideas about the importance of education. Education would produce rational human beings capable of thinking for themselves and questioning authority rather than tacitly accepting tradition. These ideas slowly came to have far-reaching effects in the colonies and, later, the new nation. While Locke's ideas spread in North America, the colonies also experienced an unprecedented wave of evangelical Protestant revivalism. Between 1739 and 1740, the Reverend George Whitefield, an enigmatic, itinerant preacher, traveled the colonies preaching Calvinist sermons to huge crowds. Unlike the rationalism of Locke, his sermons were designed to appeal to his listeners' emotions. Whitefield told his listeners that salvation could only be found by taking personal responsibility for one's own unmediated relationship with God, a process that came to be known as a conversion experience. He also argued that the current church hierarchies, populated by unconverted ministers, only stood as a barrier between the individual and God. In his wake, new traveling preachers picked up his message, and many congregations split as the Great Awakening caused an unprecedented challenge to church authorities. Both Locke and Whitefield had empowered individuals to question authority and to take their lives into their own hands. In other ways, 18th century colonists were becoming more culturally similar to Britons, a process often referred to as Anglicization. As colonial economies grew, they quickly became an important market for British manufacturing exports. Colonists with disposable income and access to British markets attempted to mimic British culture. By the middle of the 18th century, middle-class colonists could also afford items previously thought of as luxuries, like British fashions, dining wares, and more. The desire to purchase British goods meshed with the desire to enjoy British liberties. These political, intellectual, cultural, and economic developments built tensions that rose to the surface when, after the 7 Years' War, Britain finally began to implement a program of imperial reform that conflicted with colonists' understanding of the empire and their place in it.